A patient arrives in the emergency room with severe stomach cramps and an excruciating, burning pain in the soles of their feet. To a triage doctor, this immediately looks like severe food poisoning, combined with a rapid onset neuropathy, like Guillain-Barré syndrome or acute diabetic nerve damage. Because the symptoms mimic these common diseases so perfectly, the clinical team is completely blind to the actual cause, a toxic trace element circulating in the patient's bloodstream. To understand how this toxin operates, we have to look at the baseline electrical architecture of the human body. Our nerve firings and cellular gradients rely almost entirely on potassium, an ion our cells constantly pump in and out to stay alive. But this patient has ingested thallium. It is a heavy metal and a pure xenobiotic, meaning it has absolutely zero biological, structural, or metabolic purpose in human physiology. For most of biological history, environmental thallium was locked deep underground in insoluble sulfite minerals. Because ancient organisms never swam in bioavailable thallium, human cells never evolved a defense mechanism or a dedicated cellular pump to repel it. Without evolutionary defenses, the human organism has no way to distinguish the toxin from the essential nutrient. It blindly incorporates the metal into the deepest layers of the nervous system, starting a silent structural disintegration of the motor fibers before any external signs appear. Modern exposure to this toxic element typically originates from industrial infrastructure. Massive coal-fired power plants and cement manufacturing kilns vaporize trace thallium directly out of raw earth materials, releasing it into the environment where it can contaminate agricultural soil or be inhaled as dust. This animated diagram highlights the physical chemistry that makes thallium so lethal. A native potassium ion has an atomic radius of 0.133 nanometers. A thallium ion measures 0.147 nanometers. Both carry the exact same single positive charge. When this metal floats up to the cell's main power grid, the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, the cell's receptors don't see a poison. In a cruel twist of physics, the pump's activation pocket actually has an affinity for thallium up to 10 times higher than for the native potassium it was designed to catch. The cell actively prioritizes the toxin, burning its own biological energy to haul the heavy metal inside the cytoplasm against steep concentration gradients. Native potassium keeps the cell running by forming weak, temporary electrostatic connections. It plugs into an enzyme to activate it, and then quickly pops back out to be used elsewhere. Thallium operates completely differently. As a soft Lewis acid, it is aggressively attracted to the sulfur atoms found throughout our proteins. Once it enters an enzyme under the guise of potassium, it forms a massive, permanent covalent bond. The nearly identical radius allows the metal to hijack the cell's main intake pathway. But once the disguise drops, its rigid chemical bonding permanently deactivates the very machinery it just occupied. Riding these hijacked potassium channels, thallium distributes rapidly into tissues that demand the most energy. It targets the central nervous system, pools in the liver, and packs into skeletal muscle, which absorbs about 60%. The corrosive nature of the metal causes severe gastrointestinal pain and bloody diarrhea in the first 48 hours. By day 2 to 7, the energy collapse degrades the myelin sheath around nerve cables, causing excruciating, burning foot syndrome. The ribosomal protein shutdown drives the third clinical phase. Because hair follicles require a massive, continuous supply of new proteins, the halted assembly lines cause sudden, complete hair loss and thick white horizontal bands across the fingernails, typically 2 to 3 weeks after exposure. The cellular architecture faces a cascading crisis. Tissues are starving from an energy blackout and structurally failing from an inability to manufacture new proteins. For most toxic exposures, the liver and kidneys are highly effective at filtering out the threat. Initially, the liver performs flawlessly, bagging up the heavy metal and secreting a large portion into the bile to be dumped into the intestines and eliminated. But recycling systems fail catastrophically at the end of the small intestine. Scavenger receptors in the distal ileum, designed to catch valuable nutrients, mistake the thallium for potassium. They aggressively reabsorb 90%. Identifying this imposter requires moving to the pathology lab, but simply drawing the patient's blood introduces immediate pre-analytical dangers. Standard collection tubes contain rubber stoppers and additives that leach microscopic amounts of thallium into the sample. Using these poisons the test, creating an analytical artifact called pseudo-hyperthalia, a massive false alarm. Doctors must use specialized royal blue top trace element tubes. The gold standard for definitively catching the heavy metal is inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. The lab injects the fluid into an argon plasma torch burning at 8,000 Kelvin, vaporizing the sample into raw, naked ions. This completely strips away all biological material, so a spectrometer can count the atoms based strictly on their mass. This chart shows an analytical vulnerability. Lead is a heavy, adjacent metal. Its signal at markers 204 and 206 completely engulfs the 205 marker where thallium sits. To fix this, pathologists flood a cell with helium gas, filtering out lead crosstalk to reveal the poison. The testing is so rigorous that an automated quality control check showing a serial shift of over 28% demands immediate clinical investigation. Detecting it requires dual success. The clinician identifies a signal buried by mimicry, while the lab isolates a mass spike hidden by spectral interference. Once the diagnosis is confirmed, the clinical objective is clear. Doctors must introduce a chemical intervention that is structurally smarter than the body's flawed internal recycling loops. The primary antidote targets the gut. It is Prussian blue, the exact same dense, dark blue pigment used in classic art. Because the stomach cannot digest this crystalline matrix, it drops straight into the intestines. The Prussian blue lattice trades its internal potassium for thallium, permanently locking the poison inside for safe clearance. Intestinal receptors cannot break this bond. Simultaneously, an intravenous potassium drip floods the kidneys, outcompeting thallium and washing it into the urine. Patient survival relies entirely on this synchronized dual-front chemical war, locking the poison down in the gut with an art pigment while competitively flushing it from the blood with a massive potassium overload. The timing of this biochemical negotiation dictates the patient's future. Clinical models dictate that this aggressive chelation therapy must be deployed within 48 to 72 hours of exposure to preserve the motor reflexes. This creates a severe diagnostic vulnerability, known as the alopecia hindsight mistake. If a clinician dismisses the early stomach pain and burning feet, waiting for the definitive hair loss at week 3 to finally run a trace element panel, they have already failed. Missing that critical early window means the coordinate locks have already fused. The patient will be left with a lifetime of agonizing nerve pain and permanent axonal demyelination, regardless of whether the metal is eventually cleared. An element pulled from the earth with absolutely zero biological utility can systematically dismantle a human being simply by wearing the exact same structural jacket as an essential nutrient. Which leaves an important question. If a fraction of a nanometer difference in atomic radius is all it takes to trigger this level of systemic failure, what other industrial mimics might be quietly bypassing our ancient evolutionary checkpoints right now? The human architecture's greatest strength is its highly optimized, hyper-efficient network of nutrient channels. But against a pure molecular imposter, that exact efficiency becomes our fatal vulnerability.